So let's examine the role of the UN and of diplomacy in this conflict with Jonathan Katz. He's a resident fellow and director of democracy initiatives at the German Marshall Fund based in Washington, D.C. He's an expert on foreign policy and defence cooperation and has held a long list of jobs in US governments. Welcome to DW. So today we had Mr. Guterres telling Russia that its actions in Ukraine contravene international law. He's called for dialogue and for a ceasefire and for the establishment of humanitarian corridors. Is he saying all these things because that's what the Secretary General of the UN is supposed to say? Or did he really go to Moscow expecting Vladimir Putin to suddenly see the error of his ways?
Well, I think that the UN has already spoken. We've seen a number of resolutions coming through the UN condemning, including in the General Assembly, with hundreds of nations condemning Russia's actions in Ukraine. Russia's been kicked off the Human Rights Council in Geneva. And so the UN Secretary General knows exactly what's happening right now. But clearly in his role, he is trying to move a possible ceasefire, which he mentioned in his conversations in Moscow, and try to get, at least at this moment, to try to get the fighting to stop. So it is a role of the UN Secretary General to take on these tasks, but I think the Secretary General knows full well what's taking place here. He's used language that clearly places the blame for what's taking place on Russia, and what we're seeing right now, of course, is atrocities taking place. So there's very little room for negotiation right now, and Russia could immediately, if it wanted to, could pull back its troops, stop its war in Ukraine, and create conditions that could lead to a different situation than it is right now, and that does not seem in the cards.
You see, that's my point, really. Russia knows what's going on. Mr. Lavrov and Mr. Putin, they're not stupid. When Mr. Guterres goes there and makes these pronouncements, he goes there knowing that people will say one thing to his face and the actions on the ground will be different. So is he just committed to saying and doing these things because that's what you have to do?
Well, there's been multiple efforts of world leaders to speak to Mr. Putin, Mr. Lavrov, and others to get them to do the right thing. And one could argue that sitting there with Mr. Putin and Mr. Lavrov, you're absolutely walking into a situation where they're going to lie. They're going to spin disinformation. This is what they've done over the last couple of months and before the current conflict. And so the Secretary General, in some ways, has stepped into a situation where it's unlikely to be favorable, but where he's also sitting next to a liar and someone who's committing war atrocities. So it's a very awkward position. And I share Mr. Zelensky, President Zelensky's concerns. It would have been good for the UN Secretary General to have headed to Ukraine first to see what's happening there. I understand that he will go and we'll see President Zelensky, but I think it was a mistake not to go to Kiev first and to Ukraine first.
Right. Well, we're always told, of course, that negotiations are better than war. Let's hear from the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, talking about Ukraine to the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Our purpose is to make sure that they have within their hands the ability to repel the Russian aggression and, indeed, to strengthen their hand at an eventual negotiating table. We've seen no sign to date that President Putin is serious about meaningful negotiations. If he is, and if the Ukrainians engage, we'll support that.
So, Jonathan Katz, from your experience in the US State Department and elsewhere, having seen what appears to be the bad faith of the Russian state in so many of these negotiations, do you anticipate that there are sort of back-channel negotiations going on away from TV cameras?
Well, there's certainly, as we know, there's platforms. There was in Belarus and Turkey. There's other world leaders that we have seen, including Israeli officials and others, try to play a mediating role. And so Secretary Blinken was absolutely right about providing Ukraine with the weapons it needs right now to provide for its security, to strengthen its hand, so that when there is an opportunity to negotiate, that we can take those steps. And so I think for the United States and others, doing this right now, providing those weapons, providing the non-military support, economic support is really critical. And so there are likely to be back channel, front channel communications, some of which we see and this wouldn't be unexpected. But they're not successful right now because Russia is not ready to come to the table and is not willing to pull back.
So, are you effectively saying that nobody negotiates, nobody talks until the whole thing gets bombed to a standstill? It's only at that point that one side or the other says, all right, then let's actually start to talk.
No, I mean, remember, there were even talks early on in this conflict between Ukrainians and Russians directly.
Forgive me, yeah, but there were talks. There are talks and talks, and it was clear that the talks were not held in good faith. But my point really is, do you only negotiate sincerely when you've been left with no other option, when as I say, one side or the other has been bombed to a standstill?
I think in this case, we're seeing the second phase of this conflict, where Russia is now concentrating in the Donbas predominantly. And I think Russia is not going to come to the negotiating table until Mr. Putin thinks he's achieved his objectives. For the Ukrainians on their side, it's to repel, push back, retake the territories that were taken previously, and then to have a security arrangement in place and an economic security plan in place that they feel comfortable with. Now, both sides are not at that point, but negotiations or conversations continue. And that's why you see the UN Secretary General in Moscow, even if we think it's not going to amount to much. And it's why you hear people like Secretary Blinken speak to, putting Ukraine in the right position to be able to negotiate when the time is right. And clearly right now, that isn't in the cards. Russia is not coming to the table, and Ukraine is not going to back down in the face of atrocities. And that's why you see this massive support coming from the West, coming from Germany in particular, including weapons that are being provided now. And that's going to continue. And so I think, unfortunately, until we get to a moment where both sides, particularly Russia, is willing to pull back in terms of use of military, I think it's unlikely we're going to see any end to this conflict soon.
Good talking to you. Thank you for joining us. Jonathan Katz from the German Marshall Fund.
Thank you.